Welcome to the Chapter 31 Flipped Classroom. This chapter is entitled Societies at Crossroads, and the four societies that are featured in the chapter are the Ottomans, Russia, China, and Japan. And the PowerPoint is going to go through, the overview is going to go through each of these societies in turn. But first, we're going to look at how they're related to one another and why we're learning about them in this chapter. So the first thing to recognize is that all of these societies were great powers prior to the period, especially the Ottomans and the Qing. And a lot of that power came from trade, size, conquest, in the case of the Ottomans and the Qing, actually, and the Russians, too. They all faced internal pressures from their people because of political and economic issues. These internal pressures were partially self-sustaining, but also they had to do with the external pressures that were being placed on these places by Western revolutions. So there were conservative and liberal ideas that were at odds within these societies, whether they should have absolutist monarchies, like they'd pretty much always had, or whether they needed to incorporate some sort of representation. They had issues with economic change, namely the Industrial Revolution and the dawning of capitalism, and external powers were challenging them. Lastly, they all faced declining agricultural activity, whether it be from territorial losses or and from land that wasn't put into cultivation or from the environmental factors. So when responding to these things, here's the difference. All of these are commonalities, but some societies crumbled in the face of these challenges, and I'm going to argue that the Ottomans and the Qing are the societies who are the worst off after this time period. And some responded more effectively, namely Russia and Japan. So first we're going to take a look at the Ottomans. We're going to start by looking at the Ottomans prior to 1750, and we're going to do this with each of the different societies. Prior to 1750, the Ottomans' territory that they controlled was really a big benefit to them because it surrounded, this territory surrounded the Mediterranean, which meant that there was a strategic importance to their location in terms of trade, but also they controlled the Black Sea and the terminus of the Silk Roads. Plus, their vast territory meant that they had a variety of resources to draw on, whether it be wheat, cotton, silk, or apricots and almonds. The Ottoman Empire had it all. In addition, these societies for the time were fairly tolerant. Remember, they had established firstly millet communities, which allowed different individual religions to practice their own traditions. And then they also had the devshirme, which, although not tolerant, allowed them to bring up people of minority religions, namely Christians, as janissaries. So there were opportunities for expansion for these minorities. As I alluded to in the previous slide, they controlled the Mediterranean, which is why the Europeans called the Mediterranean trade the Turkey trade. This was a big motivation for getting into the Atlantic basin, or the Atlantic Ocean. And they were the terminus of the Silk Road. So they had access to a lot of luxury goods, which were desired by lots of different groups, especially Europeans. And their conservative government was very strong and stable. They were a caliphate, so their sultan had both religious and political authorities. They had religious and secular laws, which were extremely well laid out, and they were an absolute monarchy. Which was pretty standard for the day, with a very well-trained military. So many of these things that had made the Ottomans very strong are exactly what you can point to the same things for why they began to weaken after 1750. After 1750, the Ottomans experienced many territorial losses. Some were because of nationalist revolutions, such as in the Balkans and Greece. Some were because of challenges from Europeans, like the Russians and others were because of imperial pressure. Also, trade shifted more to oceans in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean basins because of European participation. This meant not only were trade routes less busy, but the Ottomans were collecting less taxes, which really weakened their their army and their entire empire, their infrastructure. This was a huge loss of revenue. In addition, their government experienced external pressures. Even though they had lost a bunch of revenue, their spending, especially at the upper levels, their spending continued, which means that they became indebted to different parties, especially Europeans. They signed unequal treaties because of this, called capitulations, where they gave Euros special privileges in the Ottoman Empire. One of the things they did was they allowed them to have tax-free status, which was doubly bad for the Ottomans because then they couldn't tax the business that was actually happening within their society, and only led to further losses. They also put in special provisions to make European goods cheaper. So all in all, these external government pressures were namely economic, but also resulted in political changes. They also had to reward Europe for helping them fight off the Russians in the Crimean War, which we'll get into in a little bit with Russia. Plus, there was vast amounts of corruption within the system. This is symbolized by janissaries, who became extremely corrupt, and really were, looking for a profit and for alliances outside of the central government. They were also against reform, especially once the empire started changing and signing these capitulations. There were power struggles between different officials. And the Ottomans recognized that there were many problems within their empire. However, their attempts at reform didn't there were very large backlashes to them. So just to give you a very brief overview here, in the 1830s to 1860s, they had very reform-minded sultans who sponsored what were called the Tanzimat reforms. These are really inspired by the European Enlightenment reforms, so liberal ideas, and liberal economic ideas as well, like capitalism. And many of the Tanzimat reforms are based on the Napoleonic Code, so another way that Napoleon influenced the world. So one of the things that changed was that religious minorities were given equality under the law instead of special treatment. No more devshirme. They also changed banking to be more Western. They embraced more capitalist policies, and they embraced more representation. Now, against all of these, there was a lot of backlash. For example, there was a conservative backlash from people who had previously held a lot of power and wanted a more centralized Ottoman Islamic government. And there was also rebellions against religious minorities, especially Christians, and as we'll see later, Armenians. So we'll continue this discussion of the Ottomans with some pictures in the next segment, and then we'll move on into the Russians.